there, my name is Nalani Brown. I'm the philanthropy coordinator at Frank Toby Jones, reading A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens at the Point Defiance Reston Senior Center. Today we are starting off on Book the Second, Chapter 9, The Head of the Gorgon. Chapter 9, The Head of the Gorgon. The castle of the Marquis was a great building. It had a vast paved courtyard from which two staircases led to meet on a terrace before the front door. Everything was made of stone. The balustrades, the urns, the flowers, and human faces, and the heads of lions carved on the facade everywhere. Exactly the same as if the Gorgon's head had looked at the castle after the works had been completed 2 centuries earlier. The Marquis ascended the stairs illuminated by a torch. The night was so quiet that the flame of the torch carried by the servant and the one fixed to the door burned as if they were in a closed room and not in the open air. There was the screeching of an owl who was disturbed by the light and noise of the water from a fountain falling into its stone container. Otherwise, there was silence. The door was closed behind the Marquis, and he had passed through a dark anteroom, on the walls of which were various hunting weapons and some whips that more than one peasant had tried when his master was irritated. Avoiding the great dark rooms, the Marquis, illuminated by the servant, climbed a staircase and stopped at a door that opened onto a corridor. He crossed the threshold and found himself in his private rooms, made up of 3 rooms, that is, the bedroom and 2 more. These rooms were high ceilings and bare floors. In the homes, there were large firewoods to hold firewood in winter, and, in a word, all the refinements of luxury that befitted a man of fortune and the position of the Marquis. The style of the furniture was Louis XV. But there were also many objects from other times that were like illustrations from old pages of French history. A table with 2 cutlery was served in the 3rd room, which was round, corresponding to one of the 4 towers and the castle had in the corners. It was a room with a high ceiling. The window was wide open, although the blinds were closed. "According to what I have been told, my nephew has not arrived," exclaimed the Marquis, noticing the table service. He had not arrived, indeed, but the servers expected him to arrive together with the Marquis. "Tonight is not likely to come," he said, "but nevertheless, leave the table as it is. I'll have dinner in a quarter of an hour." After this time, the Marquis was ready and sat alone to eat the sumptuous and chosen dinner. His seat was with his back to the window, and he had already had his soup and was about to drink a glass of Bordeaux when he put the glass on the table. "What's that?" asked calmly, looking carefully at the horizontal and black lines of the lattice. "What, Monseigneur?" "Open the window." The server obeyed. "What's up?" "Nothing, sir. There is nothing to be seen except the treetops and the shadows of the night." The servant waited for further orders. "Perfectly. Close." His master ordered immediately. The Marquis continued dinner. It was midway through when he stopped drinking a glass of wine again, having heard the noise of wheels. "Ask who has arrived," he ordered. He was the Lord's nephew. He had been slightly delayed in his journey, and although he tried to catch up with his uncle, he was unable to do so, but he was informed of him at the post house. The Marquis gave orders to tell him that dinner was awaiting him and to come as soon as possible. In a little while the traveler entered. In England, he had become known by the name of Carlos Darnay. The Monsignor received him kindly enough, but they did not shake hands. "Did you leave Paris yesterday, sir?" he asked as they sat down at the table. "Yesterday. And you?" "I come directly." "From London?" "Yes." "It took you quite a while to get here," observed the Marquis, smiling. "On the contrary, I have come directly." "Sorry, I do not mean that you spent a lot of time on the trip, but it was difficult for you to decide." "I've been arrested," and the nephew paused to add, "various matters." "There is no doubt," observed the Marquis politely. While the servant was present, no other words were spoken between them. But as soon as they had served their coffee and they were alone, the nephew, looking at the uncle, began the conversation. "I've returned, uncle, pursuing the same end that forced me to leave. I have been in great danger, but it is a sacred purpose, and I think that having brought me death, it gave me enough courage." "Death? No," said the uncle. "You don't even need to name it." "I am persuaded," continued the nephew, "that if I were in a trance of death, you would do nothing to save me." The uncle made a funny protest movement, which, however, failed to reassure his interlocutor. "Actually, sir, and judging from the data I have, perhaps you would have been quick to make the appearance around me more suspicious." "No, no, no," replied the uncle kindly. "Whatever it was," said the nephew, looking at his uncle with the utmost mistrust, "I know that with your diplomacy, you will endeavor to stop me on my way, and I am also aware that you are not very scrupulous in the media." "Scrupulous in the media." "My friend, I already told you," said the uncle. "Will you do me the favor of remembering what I warned you a long time ago?" "I remember." "Thank you," the Marquis replied softly. "Indeed, sir," continued the nephew, "I believe that your bad fortune and my good fortune have prevented me from being locked up in a prison in France." "I don't understand you," replied the uncle, sipping his coffee. "Will you please explain?" "I think that if you weren't in disgrace at court and you weren't surrounded by a cloud a few years ago, a letter from Cachet would have sent me to a fortress indefinitely." "It is possible," said the uncle, calmly. "For the honor of the family, it is possible that I had decided to annoy you at that point. I beg you to forgive me." "I note that, happily for me, the reception the other day was, as usual, very cold for you." "I don't think you should say that this circumstance is happy for you, nephew," said the uncle, with the greatest courtesy. "In your place, I wouldn't be sure of it. An excellent opportunity for reflection, surrounded by the advantages that solitude gives, could have a greater influence on your destiny than what you yourself seek. As you said, I have fallen from grace. Those little instruments of correction, these little aids of power and honor of families, these slight favors that might have caused you some discomfort, are now only obtained with the greatest difficulty. There, so many who seek them, and they are granted, comparatively, to so few. It wasn't like that before, but France, in some things, has gotten a lot worse. Our ancestors, not very remote, exercised the right of life and death over the common people. Many villains have come out of this room to be hanged. In the neighboring room, my bedroom, a rustic was stabbed for having expressed some insolent delicacies with regard to his daughter. We have lost many privileges. A new philosophy has become fashionable, and the assertion of our rights in our times, may have offered some drawbacks. Everything is very bad. The Marquis took a powder from his snuff box and shook his head. We have vindicated our rights in ancient and modern times in such a way, observed the nephew with a grim accent, that I have no doubt that our name is one of the most detested in France. Let's hope so, said the uncle. If they hate us, it is an involuntary tribute that the little ones pay us. There is not a single face, added the nephew, in all of this region that looks at me with difference, if it is not the difference of fear and slavery. It is a compliment to the greatness of the family, said the Marquis. Greatness deserved by the nobility with which he has sustained it. The Marquis took another powder and crossed his legs. But when his nephew rested his head on his hands and his elbows on the table, his uncle's face expressed such rancor that he felt badly for his earlier indifference. Repression is the only philosophy with lasting effects. The great difference of fear and slavery, friend, said the Marquis, will keep the dogs obedient to whip while this ceiling, he added, looking at the ceiling, protects us from heaven. Perhaps this would not be as long as the Marquis supposed. Had he been able to see a picture of what would have become of the castle a few years later, and like him, of 50 other castles that were in the same condition, he would hardly have recognized his property among the heap of half-burned ruins. As for the roof, he might have seen that it protected in an unexpected way those who fell under the lead of numerous muskets. In the meantime, said the Marquis, I will not take any measures to protect the honor and tranquility of the family, since you do not want to. But you are undoubtedly tired. Shall we end our conference for the evening? One more moment. An hour, if you want. Lord, said the nephew, we have done wrong, and now we reap the fruits. Have we done wrong? The Marquis repeated, smiling and pointing to his nephew and himself. Our family, our noble family, whose honor matters so much to you and me, albeit in a different way. Even in my father's day, we committed great outrages, insulting any human being who came between us and our families. Why should I speak of my father's time, which was also your time? Can I separate my father from his twin brother, his joint heir, and his successor? Death was the cause. And he has left me, replied the nephew, subject to a system that seems frightening to me, and he makes me responsible for it, although he does not let me correct it, trying to comply with the last recommendation of my mother, who begged me to be merciful and to repair the wrongs. Commit yourselves. But in vain, I look for support to carry it out. If you seek my support, nephew, the Marquis told him, you will always search in vain. You can be sure. His face expressed determination and cruelty. He touched his nephew on the chest with the tip of his finger, and as if it were a sword, made the young man shudder. I will die, my friend, perpetuating the system under which I have lived, he said. He took another snuff powder and put the box in his pocket. It is better to listen to the voice of reason. But you, Mr. Carlos, you are lost. I see it. These properties in France are lost to me, said the nephew sadly. I renounce them. Do you think you can give up both? You can give up France, but not property yet? I had no intention of claiming possession of these properties, but if they came into my power tomorrow, what I have, the vanity of believing improbable, or in 20 years, You honor me very much, said the Marquis, but I prefer this supposition. I would abandon them to go live somewhere else, and by my own means. It would not be giving up much, because all that, believe me, is nothing more than a desert of misery and ruin. Yes? Exclaimed the Marquis, looking around the luxurious room. Here it cannot be denied that everything is pleasant for the eye, but looking at things in the light of the sun, one sees nothing but a disorderly heap, a horrible waste, violence everywhere, debts, oppressions, hunger, nakedness, and suffering. Do you think so? Exclaimed the Marquis. If this property ever becomes mine, I will leave it more competent. I will leave it in more competent hands so that little by little, and assuming it arrives on time, they will free the poor vassals from the burdens that oppress them and that have led them to the hunger and ruin, so that the next generation will have to suffer less. But I already know that I will not be able to do it, because there is a curse on this earth and on this system. And what will you live on? Asked the uncle. Forgive my curiosity, but I would like to know if you will live in the shadow of your new philosophy. I will live as the compatriots will live, even the nobles, in the times to come. That is my work. In England? Yes, the honor of the family, sir, is safe in that country, and as far for the family name, it must not suffer for me, because I do not carry it in England. The Marquis called to order the immediate bedroom to be lit. He listened to the servants retreat, and as soon as he had left, he added, It seems that England is a very attractive country for you, and I see that there you have prospered. I told you before, sir, that I must be grateful for my prosperity there. Otherwise, it is my refuge. The English braggarts assure that their country is the refuge of many. Do you know a compatriot who has sought refuge there? He's a doctor. Yes. That he has a daughter? I see that you are tired, said the Marquis. Good evening. And politely bowing his head, he smiled in an enigmatic expression that did not fail to attract the attention of his nephew. Yes, the Marquis repeated, a doctor with a daughter. Yes, thus begins the new philosophy, but you're tired, so good night. It would have been the same to interrogate the stone faces that adorned the facade as it did to the Marquis when he uttered these last words and the nephew gave him an inquiring look in vain. Good evening, said the uncle. I hope to have the pleasure of seeing you again tomorrow morning. Rest well. Let them light up my lord nephew and lead him to his room. And if you like, set the bed on fire with my nephew in it, he added in a low voice. The Marquis began to walk in his night clothes, ready to lie down on that hot summer night. And while he walked with bare feet, he made no more noise than if he had been a tiger. And one could almost have believed him to be an unrepentant and evil enchanted Marquis who periodically transformed into a tiger, a change that was going to have or had already taken place at that time. As he walked, he remembered the incidents of the day, the sunset, the descent from the hill, the mill, the jail on the cliff, the little village in the hollow, the peasants at the fountain, the road laborer, who with his blue cap pointed out at the part bottom of the carriage, and also the poor man who, with his arms raised, shouted, "Dead!" "I'm cold," the Marquis murmured, and it would be best if I went to bed. She left a light on over the fireplace, brought down the gauze curtains around the bed, and as she got ready to sleep, she gave a sigh that altered the absolute silence of the night. For 3 long hours, the stone faces on the facade stared into the night. During those same hours, the horses in the stables clawed at their stables. The dogs barked, and the owl made a sound very different from that used by poets. For 3 hours, the stone faces of men and lions stared blindly into the night. The most complete darkness enveloped a landscape, and the grass-covered graves in the cemetery could not be distinguished from one another. In the village, the taxpayers and tax collectors slept soundly. Perhaps they dreamed of banquets, as often happens to those who suffer hunger, or that they lived comfortably and peacefully, as slaves and oxen yoked to the yoked dream. The water flowed from the town fountain, as well as the castle fountain, without seeing or hearing it, losing itself in the distance as the minutes that flow from the fountain of time are lost. Then, the waters from both sources began to faintly visible, and the eyes of the stone faces on the castle's facade opened. The light increased by moments until the sun appeared, illuminating the treetops and the top of the hill. And its light, the water from the fountains looked like blood, and the cheeks of stone faces were stained red. The song of the birds began, and one of them went to sing his song on the windowsill of the marquee. As the nearest stone face heard him, he seemed to be stunned, and his mouth hanging open in amazement, he stared. The sun was already in the sky, and the movement began in the village. The windows were opened, the locks were removed from the doors, and the residents came out, shuddering at the fresh morning air. And the daily work began. Some went to the spring, others went to the fields to dig, others took shelter in the miserable cattle and led the skinny cows to graze on the miserable food they could find along the way. In the church, there were 2 or 3 people kneeling before the cross, while outside, a cow was waiting for its master to finish the prayers, trying to find breakfast among the herbs at its feet. The castle woke up later, which corresponded to its hierarchy, but did so gradually and surely. First the sun dyed the hunting weapons on the walls red, then the steel blades gleamed in the morning sunlight. Doors and windows were opened. The horses in their stables began to look over their shoulders as they noticed the light of the new day. The leaves of the trees shone and flapped before the barred windows, and dogs yanked from their chains, eager to regain freedom. All these trivial incidents belonged to the routine of life and around each morning. But, on the other hand, the ringing of the castle bell was no longer customary, nor the races that the servants gave up the stairs and on the terraces, nor the haste with which some horses were saddled. It is not known how the road laborer found out about all this when he was about to start his work at the top of the hill near the village, while he had left the package containing his food on a pile of stones, and not it was worth a heron bothering to snatch it away. Had the birds told him? But whoever it was, the truth is that the road worker ran with all his soul and did not stop until he reached the source. All the villagers were there, speaking in low voices and showing no other feeling than curiosity and surprise. The skinny cows, locked as far as they could be held, stared stupidly or chewed things that were not worth chewing and found in their interrupted pasture. Some of the men from the castle and the post house, as well as the taxpayers, were more or less armed and were clustered at the end of the street, though without any object. As for the road worker, he had already entered the group of villagers and was beating his chest with his blue cap. What did it all mean? Why was Mr. Gabelle riding on the back of a horse that led a castle servant? It meant that the number of stone faces in the castle had increased by 1. Again, the Gorgon had looked into the night and added the missing stone face, and the one the others had been waiting for 200 years. The stone face rested on the pillow of the marquee. It looked like a fine mask, suddenly startled, enraged and petrified. and in the heart of that stone figure was a knife stuck. Around the handle was a piece of paper on which was written, "Take him quickly to his grave, from Jamie." Chapter 10, 2 Promises. A few months had come and gone, 12 in number, and Mr. Carlos Darnay was established in England as a teacher of French and French literature. Today he would have been called a professor, but then he was just a tutor. He gave lessons to young people who were interested in learning a living language spoken all over the world. Such teachers were not easily found at that time. The princes that were and the kings that were to be had no aptitude to teach anyone, and the ruined nobility did not yet dedicate itself to trade books or to work as cooks or carpenters. As a teacher, whose system made study enjoyable for his pupils, as an elegant translator who could do more than the aid of the dictionary, Darnay soon became known and appreciated. He was aware of the events in his country, even more interesting every day. And so, with the greatest perseverance and activity, he prospered. He had not expected to be able to achieve wealth in London, for had he such illusions, he would not have succeeded. He expected to have to work, found work and carried it out. That was their prosperity. From the times when it was always summer in Eden to the present days. When it can almost be said that winter is perpetual. Man's life has always taken the same path, which Carlos Darnay also took, that is, the one that leads to the love of a woman. Ever since he saw her for the first time in that dangerous hour for his life, he told himself that he loved her, and it seemed to him that he had never heard music more delicious than her voice, full of compassion. And he never saw a face so tenderly beautiful as that of the young woman when he saw her before the grave they had already dug for him. But he hadn't discussed the matter with her. The murder committed in the desert castle, beyond the waters, the sea, and the long dusty roads took place more than a year ago, and the young man had not uttered a single word to suggest the state of his coercion. He had very good reasons for this. It was a summer day again when he arrived in London and headed for the quiet corner of Soho, looking for an opportunity to open his heart to Dr. Manette. It was afternoon, and he knew by now that Lucia had gone out with Miss Pross. He found the doctor reading in his chair by the window. He had already regained the energy that allowed him to endure his old pains. He was now a very energetic man, of great steadiness of character, of strong resolve and vigorous action. He studied hard, slept little, easily tolerated fatigue, and was cheerful in character. Carlos Darnay introduced himself to him, and seeing him, the doctor put the book aside and held out his hand. "Glad to see you, Mr. Darnay," she exclaimed. "I've been waiting for your return for a few days. Mr. Stryver and Mr. Carton were here yesterday, and they both said you were absent longer than you should." "I appreciate your interest very much," he answered, with a certain coldness towards the two named characters, although with kindness for the doctor. "How is Miss Manette doing?" "Good," said the doctor, "and I am sure he will be glad of your return. He has gone shopping, but will be back soon." "I already knew you were not at home, doctor, and I have taken the opportunity to speak quietly with you." "Take a chair and sit down," said the doctor, with some anxiety. Carlos sat down, but did not find it so easy to begin to say what he intended. "I have been fortunate," doctor, to become a friend of the house for 1.5 years, and I hope that the matter that I am going to deal with, no. He stopped when he saw that the doctor put out his hand to interrupt him. Lou ago, the doctor said. Is it about Lucia? Indeed. It affects me to talk about her on any occasion, but more when I hear about my daughter in the tone that you do. It is my fervent admiration, my sincere tribute, and deep love, Dr. Manette, the young man replied. There was silence, after which the father said, I believe it. I do you justice, and I believe it. His disappointment was so evident that Carlos Darnay hesitated to continue. May I continue, sir? Yes, go ahead. You have surely guessed what I mean, although you cannot imagine how deep my feeling is. Dear Dr. Manette, I love your daughter deeply. I love her with all my soul, selflessly. I love her as very few have loved in the world. And since you two have loved, I let the love you felt speak for me. The doctor listened with his face and turned and his eyes fixed on the ground. And hearing the last words, he hastily stretched out his hand and exclaimed, don't tell me about it. Don't remind me. His exclamation expressed so much pain that Darnay fell silent. I beg you to forgive me, added the doctor. I have no doubt that you love Lucia. He turned the chair towards the young man, and without looking at him, he asked, Have you told my daughter about your love? No, sir. Haven't you written to her? Never. It would be unfair not to recognize that your delicacy is motivated by the consideration you have had for me, and for that I thank you. He offered his hand, although his eyes did not accompany her. I know, said Darnay respectfully, and I cannot ignore it, for I have seen you day after day, that between you, Dr. Manette, and your daughter, there is an affection so unusual, so tender, and so in harmony with the circumstances in which you live, has developed that it would be difficult to find another case like it. I know, Doctor, what, confused with the affection of a duty of a daughter who has reached the age of a woman, there exists in her heart all the love and trust for you, typical only of childhood. I know that in her childhood she had no parents, and that is why she is united with you with all of the constancy and fervor of her present years and the trust and love of the days when you were lost to her. I know that if you had been returned to her after your death, you would hardly have a more sacred character in her eyes than the one that you have for her. I know that when she embraces you, the arms of the girl, the young woman, and the woman surround you at the same time. I know that in loving you, she sees and loves her mother when she was her own age. And she sees you and loves you at my age, who loves her mother, whose heart was racked by pain, and who knows you in your dreadful destiny and in your blessed liberation. All this I know because I have been seeing it night and day in your home. The father was silent. His forehead bowed. His breathing was ragged, but he held back every other sign of the emotion that was washed over him. And as I know all this, dear Dr. Manette, added the young man, that is why I have restrained myself as much as possible. I understand that trying to introduce my love into that of the father and daughter is perhaps wanting to participate in something greater than myself. But I love your daughter, and heaven is my witness that I absolutely adore her. I believe it, answered the father sadly. I already figured it out. I believe it. But don't think, Darnay hastened to say, that if luck were so favorable to me as to be able to make your daughter my wife, I would try. Not for a moment to establish the smallest separation between her and you, for that, besides being a low action, it could not, perhaps, achieve it. If I had, or could have such a hidden intent in my mind, I would not be worthy to touch her hand. And saying these words, he put his hands on the doctor's. No, dear Dr. Manette, like you, I am a voluntary exile from France. Like you, I've left my homeland because of its mistakes, its oppressions, and its miseries. As you live from my work, waiting for better times, I only aspire to the happiness of sharing your luck, your life, and your home, and to be faithful to you until death. Not to participate in Lucy's privilege and being your daughter, your companion and your friend, but to help her and to unite her more to you as if it were possible. The father looked at the young man for the first time since he had spoken. Evidently in his mind, there was a struggle of ideas and feelings. You speak, my dear Darnay, with such tenderness and with such integrity, that I thank you with all my heart, and in return I will open mine to you. Do you have any reason to believe that Lucy loves you? Still no. The object of the confidence that you have made to me is to make sure of it with my consent? Do not. I think it will take me a few weeks to find out. Do you want me to advise and guide you? I ask nothing, sir, but I think you can do it, and I have no doubt that you will. Do you want me to make you any promises? Yes, sir. Which one? I am convinced that without your help I cannot hope for anything, because even if I had the immense happiness that Miss Manette kept my image in her pure heart, she could not continue in it against the love of her father. Being the case, you will notice what might happen otherwise. I realize that a word from your father in favor of a suitor can tip the scales towards him. That is precisely why, Dr. Manette, said Darnay most firmly, I am not asking you to say this word, nor would I ask for it even if my life depended on it. I'm sure of it, you know, Darnay, that from deep loves, as well as intense dissensions, mysteries arise. That is why my daughter Lucy is a mystery to me in certain things, and I do not know what the state of her heart may be. Can you tell me, sir, if someone wants it? Said the father, finishing the sentence. That is what I wanted to say. The father paused before answering. You yourself have seen Mr. Carton here. Sometimes Mr. Stryver comes too. In any case, the possible suitors to my daughter's hand are the two of them. Or both, said Darnay. I hadn't thought of both, and it doesn't seem likely, but you wanted a promise from me. Tell me which one.
At the Ruston Point Defiance.
The one that if Miss Manette on some occasion makes you a confidence similar to mine, you give her testimony of what I've told you, expressing that you believe in the sincerity of my words. I hope I deserve such a high regard from you that I do not use your influence against me. I promise you, replied the doctor. I believe that your object is the one that you have loyalty and honesty exhibited. I believe that your intention is to perpetuate and not weaken the ties that unite me with my daughter, who is more dear to me than my own life. If she told me one day that you are necessary to her happiness, I would give it to you at once. And if there were, Darnay, if there were. The young man shook his hand gratefully, and the doctor continued. If there were whims, reasons, fear, or anything else, ancient or recent, against the man my daughter loved, as long as he was not personally responsible. I would forget everything out of love for my daughter. She's everything to me. More than suffering, more than torment, more than... But let's leave that. The doctor paused and then added, I have deviated from the question without realizing it. It seemed to me that you wanted to tell me something else. I wanted to tell you that your trust in me must be reciprocated with mine. My current name, although slightly different from the one assigned to me by my mother, is not, as you will remember, my real name. I'm going to tell you what it is and why I'm in England. Hush, said the doctor. I wish to tell you, to better deserve your trust, because I dislike having secrets from you. Shut up, the doctor repeated. You will tell me when I ask you, but not before. If Lucy accepts your love, if it corresponds to her, you will tell me on the morning of your wedding. Now go, and God bless you. It was already dark when Darnay left the house, and it was still an hour before Lucy's return. She went straight to see her father, for Miss Pross went upstairs, but was most surprised to see her father's chair vacated. Dad? She called. My father. She received no reply, but some hammering from the bedroom reached her ears. The young woman crossed the central room and, reaching the bedroom door, looked and backed away in fear. What will I do? My God, what will I do? Her uncertainty did not last long, because he approached the door, knocked on the wood, and called She approached the door, knocked on the wood, and called softly for her father. The noise ceased as soon as her voice resounded, and her father came out and began to pace the room. Lucy was walking with her. That night, Lucy jumped out of the bed to visit her father. She saw that he was sound asleep, and that the cobbler's stool and tools, as well as the half-finished work, were as usual. That is the end of chapter 10. Next time, we're going to begin on book the second, chapter 11, A Conversation of Friends. It's a great read today. Very crazy stuff. That was chapters 9 and 10 of A Tale of Two Cities. My name is Nalani Brown, the philanthropy coordinator of Frank Toby Jones Reading at Defiance Ruston Senior Center. Thank you for listening.